Samson, the Israelite hero villain. One of the absolute wildest stories in the Bible comes with the judge and champion of Israel named Samson. His story checks off all the excellent story boxes. It's filled with love, hate, revenge, war, adventure, riddles, and much more. For most of my life, I had believed his story was historical. I started realizing much of the Bible wasn't history and carried value in a different way. In this documentary, we will discuss the mythologies which influenced the author of this story in Judges, from ancient Mesopotamia to Greece. We will give you great reasons to understand these stories in a completely different light. Behind the flesh of an Israelite warrior, you just might find the shining sun battling it out with the heavenly bodies. Or you may discover Samson is just another Heracles hero who has been polished to fit his own national context. Let's first give you a brief rundown of the story of Samson from birth to death. The life of the hero, Judges 13 through 16. Samson was born to faithful Manoah from the tribe of Dan and his chosen wife, who was barren. The terrifying angel of the Lord appeared to his wife and told her she would divinely conceive and bear a son who would begin to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. She was told not to drink wine or eat anything unclean, as her son would be a Nazirite dedicated to God from birth. When Samson was grown, he saw an attractive Philistine woman in Timnah that he wanted to marry. His parents were distressed that he wanted to marry outside of Israel, but he insisted. On the way to Timnah, a young frightening lion attacked Samson. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as if it was a young goat. But he did not tell his parents what he had done. Later, when passing by the decomposed lion's carcass, Samson saw a swarm of bees and honey inside it. He scooped out the honey, ate some of it, and gave some to his parents, but did not reveal its source. Samson insisted on marrying Timnah, so at the wedding feast, Samson proposed a clever riddle to his Philistine companions, betting them sets of clothing if they could solve it within 7 days of the feast. Under threat, his new wife pleaded with Samson until he told her the meaning of the riddle. She told the coercive Philistine men, who then were able to answer Samson's clever riddle on the last day. Samson knew these Philistines had cheated him. Furious, Samson traveled to Ashkelon, killed 30 Philistines, took their clothing, and gave it to the companions to pay his debt. In anger, Samson left his wife, and her father gave her to one of the companions instead. To get revenge, Samson captured 300 wild foxes, tied their furry tails together in pairs, attached torches, and let them run through the Philistines' grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves, burning them down. To get revenge, the Philistines fight fire with fire by burning Samson's former wife and her father to death. In retaliation, Samson attacked them again and killed many more Philistines. Later, Samson fell in love with another beautiful, tricky Philistine woman named Delilah in the valley of Sorek. The rich Philistine rulers approached her and offered her 1,100 shekels of silver if she could discover the secret of Samson's strength. After persistently asking him with 3 failed attempts to subdue him, Samson finally told her that his strength came from his uncut hair as a Nazirite. While he was sleeping on the 4th attempt, sneaky Delilah had a servant cut his hair and his strength left him. The Philistines captured him, gouged out his eyes, and brought him to Gaza, where he was bound and made to grind grain in prison. Over time, Samson's hair began to grow again while in prison. The Philistine leaders gathered in the temple of their god Dagon to offer a sacrifice and celebrate their capture of Samson. They brought Samson out to entertain them. Samson asked the servant who was leading him to let him lean against the pillars supporting the temple to rest. Samson prayed to God to strengthen him one last time. He pushed with all his might against the 2 pillars, dislodging them from their bases. This collapsed the temple, killing all the Philistine rulers and thousands more inside. Samson also died, paying the ultimate price to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. The Strange Biography of Samson, Dr. Yair Zakovitch. The story of Samson in the Bible isn't quite what it seems. Some parts were left out because they didn't quite fit the religious teachings of the time. Dr. Yair Zakovitch in 2003 explains that originally, Samson might have been seen as the son of a god, like a superhero, but in the Bible, his super strength is said to come from God, as long as he follows certain rules. Even though the story of Samson was very popular, the people who wrote the Bible had to adjust it to fit their beliefs about one God. In this version of the story, Samson isn't always shown in the best light. This sets the stage for the Bible to introduce kings as leaders in the next part of the story. Zooming out to an airplane view, the Bible carries a theme of God leading his people instead of a king like the other nations. So God sends prophets to lead his people like Moses and Joshua. But after these two die, and when Israel gets into trouble and cries out to God, he sends a judge. God is kind and forgiving, so every time the people of Israel ask him for help, he sends a leader to rescue them. These leaders, called judges, aren't as great as the earlier prophets, even though there's a pattern in the book of Judges where the people make mistakes, face consequences, ask God for help, and then get rescued. It seems like with each new judge, the quality of leadership goes down a bit. God always provided leaders, called judges, to help guide the people of Israel. Ehud was one of the first judges we really get to know about, and he was dedicated and faithful. But as we read on, the following judges aren't as steadfast. For example, when the prophetess Deborah asks Barak to rescue the people, he hesitates and says he'll only go if she comes with him. Then there's Gideon, who wants clear signs from God before doing anything. Even after making a big statement about not wanting power for him or his family, Gideon sets up a kind of shrine in his hometown that leads the people astray. His bad choices end up having sad consequences for his family, especially when his own son Abimelech causes a lot of trouble. Things seem to get worse with the next judges. Jephthah, another leader, makes a hasty promise that results in a tragic sacrifice involving his daughter. When faced with a dispute, instead of finding a peaceful solution, he chooses violence and many people die. Then comes Samson, who makes a lot of bad decisions. His actions really make it clear that the people of Israel need a more stable form of leadership. In the book of Judges, end with chaos and confusion, hinting that a king might be the answer. The idea of a monarchy starts to form, leading to the introduction of kings in the next part of the Bible. But even then, things don't get easier between God and his people.
When we look back at the leaders of Israel, it's clear that as people made more mistakes, their leaders got worse. Samson stands out as the last and most troubling of these leaders. After him, the biggest change happens. They get a king.
Here's how Samson is different from other leaders in the book of Judges. Length of story. Samson's story takes up a lot more space than the other judges. His tale is 4 chapters long, making up about a fifth of the entire book. Super strength. Samson's physical dimensions are those of a giant. Although this is indicated only by way of the description of his carrying the gates of Gaza, Judges 16:1-3, only a giant would be capable of such a feat. Grasping the 2 gate posts and the gate as observed by the rabbis. R. Simeon, the pious, said,
Samson's shoulders measured 60 cubits, as it is said, but Samson lay in bed only till midnight. At midnight he got up, grasped the doors of the town gate, together with the 2 gate posts, and pulled them out along with the bar. He placed them on his shoulders, and there is a tradition that the gates of Gaza are not less than 60 cubits in width.
Lone warrior. Unlike other leaders, Samson didn't lead an army. He faced his enemies by himself. There were even times when his own people wanted to hand him over to the enemy. Personal battles. Samson's fights weren't about defending his tribe or people. His battles were more personal and often linked to his love life. Multiple battles. While other judges had one big battle and then peace, Samson was constantly fighting throughout his story. Full life story. Samson is unique because we get to know about his whole life, from birth to death. The other judges don't get such detailed coverage. Dr. Yair Zakovitch expresses it this way.
This singular figure invites our wonderment. How did these stories of sexual passions and scandals find their way into the history of God's redemption of Israel? What changes did the stories undergo before being allowed into the holy book? Indeed, the incorporation of the Samson stories into the chronicles of God's deliverance of Israel is perplexing, and not only because the hero seems so alien to the spirit of the Bible. Many of the details in the Samson stories are similar to those in mythological traditions, though the monotheistic worldview does not readily accommodate such mythologies. Accordingly, the stories underwent a process of demythologization before they could be included in the Holy Scriptures. Stories were disentangled from their mythological origins and made to conform to a monotheistic belief system. The rejection of the myth is accomplished surreptitiously using what I call covert polemics. In the very telling of the tale, the storyteller rejects the story's mythological underpinnings and transforms it into a new written version. We will examine and follow these covert polemics as they function in the story of Samson's birth. This is also the place to mention another relevant term, literary archaeology. This refers to the unearthing of traditions which, having been deemed inadmissible by the Bible's writers, nonetheless continued their lives in the world of oral literature until, in the post-biblical period, when the ideas and beliefs they conveyed were no longer viewed as threatening, they were written down. As opposed to the classic archaeologist who digs deeper and deeper in order to reveal more ancient strata, the literary archaeologist may in fact find more archaic layers of a story in later texts from the Second Temple period, apocryphal books, Jewish Hellenistic texts, rabbinic literature, and so on.
I totally agree with the sentiment that the authors of the Bible are demythologizing, and I see this in several other places throughout the primary history of the Bible. One thing I love about his approach is the literary archaeology. This suggests that certain stories of these Bible characters were floating around before, during, and after the biblical version or final redactor put their final touches on this text. He suggests that many of the traditions we find in other texts, including comments by rabbis, can often be from traditions which predate the biblical stories we read about today. This demythologizing seems to be a rather late action on the author's part, it would seem. This is where Dr. Yair Zakovitch highlights Samson's birth narrative, pointing to its mythical origins. A son of God. Samson's birth story from chapter 13 in Judges starts off similar to other stories in the Bible, where women who couldn't have kids end up having a son. Think of women like Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel. Samson's story is unique even among these. When you compare it to the New Testament stories about Jesus' birth, you'll see what I mean. Another interesting birth story is in Genesis 6, 1-4. It's about powerful beings, gods, from the sky who come to earth, have children with human women, and those kids turn out to be giant heroes. This story has a hint of old myths where the children would be like gods, but here they're just really big people with heroic qualities. This Genesis narrative may be jabbing at a tradition such as an Ugaritic story where the god El had sex with mortal women, birthing Shakar and Shalem, who eventually became deities. Within the annals of Greek mythological narratives, a pertinent tale emerges concerning the birth of Heracles, the progeny of Zeus, the preeminent deity. In this narrative, Zeus, journeying to Thebes, encounters Alcmene, Heracles' would-be mother, in the absence of her spouse, Amphitryon, who was engaged in military campaign. Zeus, employing deception by assuming the look of Amphitryon, has sex with Alcmene and subsequently departs. Upon the triumphant return of Amphitryon, he is met with considerable confusion as Alcmene conveys the belief of their prior evening's union. They subsequently also engage in intimate relations. This results in Alcmene birthing twins of different natures, Heracles bearing resemblance to his divine father Zeus, and his sibling, a mere mortal, the offspring of Amphitryon. A notable rendition of Heracles' birth narrative is detailed in Hesiod's The Shield of Heracles, lines 27 to 56.7. Drawing a parallel to biblical narratives, while Heracles ascends to divinity via his birth, conceived from the relationship between a mortal and a deity, the biblical character of Samson presents a stark contrast. Samson's mother, akin to several other matriarchs in biblical accounts, is afflicted with infertility. Consequently, the biblical tales underscore the requirement of divine intervention or miraculous occurrences, diverging from the Greek myth where the deity's motive for intervention emanates from personal passion. In the narrative, Manoah's wife encounters a divine messenger rather than the Lord directly, consistent with the theological understanding that God does not commonly engage directly with humanity. This figure, described as a man of God, with an angelic and intimidating countenance, establishes his credibility through his inexplicable insight into her barrenness. Subsequently, he foretells the birth of Samson. Intriguingly, the narrative reveals traces of mythological elements, evident in the narrative's emphasis on Manoah's wife over Manoah himself. The divine messenger's approach when she is alone, reminiscent of Alchemenes' encounter in Greek mythology, is replete with subtexts, particularly when she describes the encounter using phrasing that can imply intimacy. Her solitude is further highlighted during a second encounter in a field, a setting historically associated with sexual activities. Deuteronomy 22:25-26.
But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor.
The narrative's construction implies an intentional distancing from a foundational mythological theme, where a divine being produces a heroic child with a mortal. The author in Samson's story is clearly trying to brush the mythological undertones under the rug, but gives them a partial recognition, as is often seen in other biblical stories. As Samson's mother expresses in this scene that an angel came to her, her husband seems to infer that they only spoke. However, the husband wants this man of God to visit her again, which he does. This angel meets her in a field again, but without her husband. So she goes and tells her husband, who then comes and meets the divine one. What is this author up to? Dr. Zakovitch rightly points out the intentional ambiguity surrounding the mythological origins of the narrative becomes apparent through the omission of an etymology for Samson's name. This absence seems to be a deliberate effort to disassociate Samson, or Shimshon in Hebrew, from Shemesh, which translates to sun, and by extension, the sun god. The intrinsic correlation between Samson's name and the term for sun was not overlooked by rabbinic scholars, who, recognizing the potential theological implications, proposed their own interpretations to navigate this complexity.
R. Johanan also said, Samson was called by the name of the Holy One. Blessed be he, as it is said, for the Lord God is a sun and a shield.
Josephus Flavius, firmly situated within the realm of Hellenistic thought and belief systems, recognized the profound implications of the mythological narrative in relation to the birth story. He too grappled with the complexities surrounding the encounter between the angel and Manoah's wife. Look at what Josephus writes.
Manoah was more overly, madly enamored of his wife and hence inordinately jealous. Now once when his wife was alone, a specter appeared to her from God, in the likeness of a comely and tall youth, bringing her the good news of the approaching birth of a son through God's good providence, a son goodly and illustrious for strength, by whom on his reaching man's estate the Philistines would be afflicted. And having thus spoken, the visitor departed, having come but to execute God's will. The woman, when her husband arrived, reported that she had heard from the angel, extolling the young man's comeliness and stature in such wise that he, in his jealousy, was driven by these praises to distraction and to conceive the suspicions that such passion arouses. But she, wishing to allay her husband's unreasonable distress, entreated God to send the angel again, that her husband also might see him. And again, by the grace of God, the angel came, while they were in the suburb, and appeared to the woman when parted from her husband. She besought him to stay until she could fetch her husband, and obtaining his absence, went in pursuit of Manoah. But the husband, on beholding the angel, even then did not dissent from his suspicion, and he requested him to repeat to him all that he had revealed to his wife. The angel having declared that it would suffice that it should be made known to her alone, Manoah bade him say who he was, in order that on the birth of the child they might tender him their thanks and make him a present. He replied that he had need of naught, for it was not from want that he had announced this good news of the birth of the child. And though Manoah invited him to stay and partake of hospitality, he consented not.
It is clear here that Josephus sees how the idea this divine one may have had sex with Manoah's wife, as all the other mythological stories of divine births have so much overlap to Samson's birth narrative, while other barren women birth narratives are further from these mythical elements. The story Rachel's miraculous conception deserves our attention.
Now God remembered Rachel, God heeded her, and opened her womb.
Within this narrative, we can discern a phrase that might harken back to its original intention, suggesting the divine opening of the womb as a literal interaction between the deity and the woman. While the Hebrew Bible deviates from such a mythical archetype, it reemerges in a more nuanced form in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, the narrative of Mary, who was not barren, parallels that of Heracles' mother.
It notes when his mother, Mary, had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit.
The author, in his judicious rendition, refrains from providing an explicit portrayal of the divine act. Further, the emphasis on Mary's perpetual virginity underscores the absence of physical contact in this divine conception. Is this perpetual virginity concept a theological reaction, hiding the implications of how people would have understood this in the comic mythic genre? I believe so. The Bible author clearly tried to conceal Samson's divine birth as well as his size. He carried massive city gates on his shoulders. They also make sure to emphasize that Samson's strength is completely reliant on God giving it to him. This ongoing motif seems to spin away from the other demigod strong heroes like Gilgamesh, Melqart, Heracles, etc. Foreign women, a big no-no. Later in his story, Samson falls head over heels for another woman, Delilah, who eventually leads to his downfall. If you look closely, there are a lot of parallels between Samson's story with Delilah and his earlier relationship with a woman from Timnah. In both tales, the Philistines cunningly use the woman Samson loves to figure out his secrets. With the Timnah woman, they wanted the answer to his tricky riddle, and with Delilah, they aimed to find out the source of his incredible strength. Both women, after lots of pestering, finally get Samson to spill the beans, and although these secrets lead to trouble for Samson, he also manages to give the Philistines a run for their money each time. Even when things look bleak, he ends up taking a lot of Philistines down with him, especially when they have him captured. And in both stories, when things get really tough, Samson turns to God for help. Interestingly, both tales share some similar wording and style too. Number 1, the words of the Philistines to the women. Coax your husband, Judges 14:15. Coax him, 16:5. 2, the words of the women to Samson as each tries to persuade him to reveal his secrets. You really hate me. You don't love me. Judges 14:6. How can you say you love me? Judges 16:15. Number 3. The particular manner of the woman's persuasion, she nagged him so, Judges 14:7. After she nagged him, Judges 16:6. Number 4. At Lehi, the Philistines bound Samson with 2 new ropes, Judges 15:13. Delilah ties Samson up with new ropes, Judges 16:11-12. Number 5. At Lehi, the ropes loosened like flax that catches fire, Judges 15:14. With Delilah, as a strand of tow comes apart at the touch of fire, Judges 16:9. Samson's story was most likely written by one author, and the warning of going after foreign women is evident. In Samson's adventures, even though a lot of action revolves around women, there's very little about romance or intimacy. The writers of these ancient texts often downplayed or hinted at such matters, especially in holy books. It's almost as if the original, juicier details got edited out, leaving just the essential parts of the story for the scriptures. For some context, consider these other stories from the same time. 1. Jael. A woman manages to defeat Sisera, a mighty warrior, not once, but twice. Check out Judges 4:17-21 and Judges 5:24-27. 2. Queen Esther uses her charm to expose the wicked Haman during a fancy dinner party, especially in Esther 7, verse 8. Number 3. Then there's Judith, who deceives an Assyrian general named Holofernes. Just when he thinks she's into him, she turns the tables. Read Judith 10-13. And 4. Don't forget Proverbs 7:6-27. Where a mysterious foreign woman lures a young man into danger with promises of love. Each of these tales, like Samson's, has hints of allure and danger intertwined. It's fascinating how ancient writers often use the theme of attraction to drive their narratives forward. Josephus mentions that Delilah got Samson drunk before tying him up. This part isn't in the original Bible story from Judges 16, probably because Samson wasn't supposed to drink due to his religious vows. Only cutting his hair broke his strength. There are other stories with a similar theme. In one, Sisera is thirsty, asks for water, but gets milk. Some believe this milk had deeper meanings, or that it was used to get him drunk. In another tale, Holofernes drinks so much wine that he passes out, making it easier for him to be defeated. In the story of Esther, the plot against Haman unfolds at a wine party. As for Samson and Delilah, the Bible doesn't specifically say they were intimate. It only mentions that she made him fall asleep on her lap. But some scholars think there's a hidden meaning, suggesting there might have been more to their relationship. What does "and she pressed him" mean? R. Isaac of the school of Archenemies said, "At the time of consumption, she detached herself from him." In the narrative of Jael and Sisera, particularly in its poetic form, there are evident hints at sexual undertones. Between her legs, he sank, Kara, lay, Nephal, outstretched, Shakaf. Between her legs, he sank, Kara, lay, Nephal, still, where he sank, Kara, there he lay, Nephal, destroyed, Judges 5:27. The phrasing "between her legs" is a rare occurrence in the biblical texts, appearing only in this context and in Deuteronomy 28:57, where it unmistakably refers to childbirth, the afterbirth that issues from between her legs. This sexual innuendo within the poetic lines was also identified by the rabbis. Between her legs, this language is understood euphemistically. R. Johanan commented, "The debauched Sisera had engaged in intimate relations 7 times that day. As it is stated, between her legs he sunk, he fell, he lay at her feet, he sunk, he fell, where he sunk, there he fell down dead." In Delilah's ultimate endeavor to discern Samson's source of strength, the narrative clearly notes that she induces him into a slumber. This state of sleep facilitates Delilah's ability to encapsulate Samson and deprive him of his formidable might. The description that she puts him to sleep on her knees, as the Septuagint version suggests, between her knees, evokes a parallel with the phrase between her legs from Judges 5:27. Nevertheless, the narrative in question remains reticent, refraining from insinuating that this restful state was a consequence of intoxication or intimate relations. The story of Samson in the book of Judges has been toned down quite a bit. Originally, he was seen as this mythological hero, like the son of a god, but the final version we see in the Bible presents him as a normal man who just gets his strength from God as long as he follows certain rules. The story was too popular to leave out, but it was adjusted to fit the beliefs of the time. In this version, Samson isn't really shown in the best light and is actually seen as one of the least ideal leaders, making way for the idea that maybe having a king would be better. Samson and Mythical Parallels, 1907, Paul Carus. As I ventured into making this documentary, I wanted to get the latest cutting-edge scholarship on Samson, which prompted our previous sections with Dr. Yair Zakovitch, who mainly shows the clear editorial scrub on this mythological story. I was encouraged by Dr. Seth L. Sanders to read his article and found great use of it. My research led me down this wild rabbit trail back to a book published from 1907 by Paul Carus. Now, it's safe to say that scholarship has come a long way since this time in various fields, especially philology, as you will see. My question is, did he get more right than wrong about the myth of Samson? Most modern scholars want to focus on the narrative structure of Samson within the biblical corpus and don't do too much comparative mythology. I found this 1907 work fun, and I hope you will too. Here was my takeaway from the research. Dr. Paul Carus insists Samson is neither more nor less than Heracles was to the Greeks, Siegfried to the Germans, Melqart to the Phoenicians, Gilgamesh to the Babylonians, etc. Samson is as much Hebrew as Siegfried is a German and Heracles a Greek. He is a national hero of the tribe of Dan, and the legendary features of the story are way too palpable to make it probable that there are many theologians now living who, after reconsideration of the facts, would still defend its historical character. If you want to really anger someone, I mean really quick, that's really easy. First tell them that Heracles is a spin-off version of the much earlier Semitic Gilgamesh mythology, or Phoenician Melqart, and that the Samson myth is most likely inspired by both the Greek Heracles, Melqart, or Gilgamesh epic for its tale. The claim that the Greek Heracles was a Semitic importation has upset many Greek scholars, but several classicists suggest that Heracles was imported from Semitic roots, most likely from Gilgamesh. It's apparent that the flood myths traveled from the east into the Greek Deucalion stories. The Bible's authors imported the mythical tapestry from probably all three figures. Each myth has created their own genius story. The question of historicity is honestly irrelevant. If there ever was a guy, he is completely lost to us, buried under the layers of legendary literature. According to Dr. Gustav Ruskoff, Samson also has 12 labors. The labors are as follows. 1. He kills a lion with his hands. It is characteristic of Samson as well as of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian solar hero, and also of Heracles, that the lion is slain without the use of any weapon. 2. At his marriage at Timnath, he proposes a riddle and incidentally slays 30 Philistines at Ascalon. 3. He catches 300 foxes and chases them with firebrands through the fields of the Philistines. 4. The Philistines burn his wife and father-in-law's whole family, which induces him to make a great slaughter among them, whereupon he flees into the mountains of Judah and hides in the cleft of the cliff Etam. 5. Samson is bound by the men of Judah and delivered to the Philistines, who take him to Lehi, but the ropes on his arms become like flax that has caught fire. 6. Samson picks up the jawbone of an ass and kills multitudes of his enemies. 7. Being overcome with thirst, he prays for God, and a spring breaks forth from the ass's jawbone. 8. When visiting a woman at Gaza, he escapes the ambush of the Philistines by rising at midnight and carrying with him the 2 doors of the city gate, which he plants upon the hill which is in the front of Hebron. 9. Now he became entangled with Delilah. The treacherous woman bound him with 7 new bowstrings, but when the Philistines came upon him, he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of tow snaps at the breath of fire. 10. Delilah bound him with 7 new ropes, but he snapped the ropes off from his arms like thread. 11. Delilah weaves the 7 braids of his hair into the web of her loom, but he pulled up the loom with the web and escaped the 3rd time. 12. Finally, Samson betrays the secret of his strength, and Delilah had the 7 braids of his hair shaved. He was taken prisoner and blinded. But when his hair had grown again, his strength returned and enabled him to break down the 2 pillars of the Dagon temple, by which deed he buried himself with the multitude of his enemies under the ruins of the temple. Dr. Carus does not make a big deal about Samson having 12 adventures, similar to Heracles' 12 tasks or the year's 12 months. But he says it's pretty interesting that Raskov, the guy most people trust about the realness of the Samson story, is the one suggesting it. The lion, the bee, and Samson's riddle. In the story of Samson, there's a curious bit about a lion, which stands as a symbol for the sun's heat, and by extension, the sun god. The same sun god is known for taming this heat, earning him the title of the lion's conqueror. Now here's the puzzling part. Samson speaks of finding honey inside a lion, but here's the catch. Bees don't make homes in dead animals. This tells us that the original story might have been mixed up over time. Samson's riddle goes something like this. Out of the eater comes something to eat, and out of the sour one comes something sweet. The answer to which he gives is, what is sweeter than honey, and what is more sour than a lion? The riddle doesn't quite fit together if you take it at face value, but imagine if folks back then knew a link between bees and lions that we don't think about now. There's an old Mithraic artifact showing a lion with a bee in its mouth, suggesting that bees might make honey when the sun is in the Leo zodiac. So the riddle could be asking, when do you find honey in a lion? With the answer being when the sun god defeats the lion. This leads us to,
out of the eater comes something to eat, and out of the sour one comes something sweet.
Something along the line, this clever meaning seems to have been lost in the telling of Samson's story, maybe because folks wanted to keep out old myths and legends. The foxes with firebrands. The narrative of Samson deploying 300 foxes with ignited tails finds an enlightening parallel when juxtaposed against the Roman ceremonial practice observed during the festival of Ceres. This tradition, originally an elite patrician rite, gained such widespread fame that even the plebeians regularly participated as honored guests, notably on the festival's central day, which may be April the 19th. Minor offerings, mostly edible treats such as nuts, were spread among the attendees. Instead of the customary chariot races, the spectacle centered on red foxes with tails on fire racing across the circus. Scholars interpret this act as symbolic of the grain disease termed robigo, as the title resonates with the both red fox and the reddish affliction impacting wheat crops. In Ovid's work, Fasti, Book 4, lines 679 and following, the Roman poet narrates a story from Carsioli, presumably clarifying the origins of the ceremonial act. He recounts a tale of a young lad aged around 12 who, after capturing a fox constantly stealing the owner's hens, wrapped it with hay and straw and lit it on fire. This fox, in its frantic attempt to escape, dashed into the wheat fields, setting them ablaze. As a reactionary measure, a decree was instituted mandating the execution of all captured foxes on enactment visibly enacted during the Cerealia. Drawing a comparison between Samson's deployment of firebrand foxes and their Roman analogues is not mere serendipity. Instead, it underscores the persistence of an archaic motif prevalent in ancient cultures, albeit obscured or forgotten in various global traditions. Semele, Dido, and the legends of sun heroes' brides. In old myths, it's not rare for sun heroes, think of them as ancient superheroes connected with the sun, to have brides who tragically meet their end in fire. Take Semele, for example. She faced a tragic end when she met Zeus, king of gods. Similarly, when we hear that Samson's wife was burnt with her family, it sounds like a classic mythical tale, even if it doesn't seem like a true story. Speaking of sun heroes, Aeneas is another big name. He's not just famous because he's the son of Venus, the goddess of love, or because he traveled the world, or even because he took a trip to the underworld. One of his dramatic love stories also hints at his sun hero status. He fell head over heels for Dido, the queen of Carthage, but due to godly orders, he had to leave her. Heartbroken, Dido chose to end her life by setting herself on fire, becoming a tragic symbol of lost love. Now, the story of Dido, as told by the poet Virgil, is a bit different from earlier versions. Some ancient records suggest that Dido actually sacrificed herself for another guy, her husband Sycarbus. And guess what? This tale is tied back to other gods and goddesses, hinting that Dido might have connections to the goddess Tanith. Plus, the name Sycarbus has some ancient meanings that connect to words like commemoration. There's a treasure trove of such legends about brides linked to sun heroes. Another story talks about Semiramis, like many such tales. This myth got mixed with real history, changing its nature. The core idea remains in stories like that of Astarte and Aphrodite, both of whom had tragic tales of love and loss. Samson's great escape. Imagine a superhero who, after a massive victory, decides to hide away instead of celebrating. That's what happened with Samson, a legendary hero. Some scholars like Steinthal noticed that many old heroes such as Apollo and Indra also took off and hid after their big battles. Steinthal believes this hiding act is like a calm after a storm. Imagine two natural powers clashing in the sky, then everything goes silent as one goes into hiding. Now, while Steinthal's theory might sound cool, it doesn't really convince everyone. Some feel it's a bit, I guess you'd say, of a stretch. Looking at Samson's story, he had good reasons to lay low. He had taken out 30 men and caused quite a bit of chaos. Since the Philistines were in charge, they weren't going to let him roam free. They would obviously want to capture this troublemaker. However, there's an exciting pattern here. Many heroes linked to the sun have this hiding phase in their tales. If we dive deep into Samson's story, we could think of his hiding as the sun going behind clouds, especially after a really hot day. It's like the sun hero used up all his fiery arrows in a big battle. The best part, when everyone thinks the sun hero's been defeated, he burst back with a bang. Samson did exactly that. When captured, he grabbed an unlikely weapon, a jawbone, and defeated 1,000 enemies. Quite the superhero move, right? The legendary jawbone. In the story of Samson, there's a bit about him using the jawbone of an ass as a weapon. Some folks think a particular hill was named after this jawbone incident, the Hill of the Jawbone. The story tells us that Samson dropped this jawbone weapon here. There's a cool fact. There's a place in Greece at the southern tip of Laconia that's called Ass's Jawbone in Greek. An ancient geographer named Strabo mentioned it. Maybe some old hero over there did something similar to Samson, but their story got lost over time. Now, back in the day before people had horses as pets, they often used the jawbones of asses as weapons. Before fancy swords were made of metal, it seems like this jawbone design was popular. There's a theory that old sickle swords might have been inspired by this design. Marduk and Perseus, ancient dragon-fighting heroes, seem to have weapons resembling a jawbone. In fact, there's an old image showing Marduk ready to take on Tiamat, a dragon, with a sword shaped like a sickle hanging behind him. In an ancient text about the creation, it says,
"He made ready a bow, prepared it for a weapon. He armed himself with the falchion, attaching it to his belt. He took the god weapon, his right hand seizing it. Bow and quiver he hung at his side. He caused a lightning flash to precede him, whose interior he filled with shooting flames."
If you look at old pictures of a god named Sylvanus, you'll notice he's shown with a sickle that looks like a jawbone. As time went on, these designs changed to look more like modern sickles. There's another old god, Kronos, who's also seen holding something that looks a lot like the jawbone of an ass. All these clues might suggest that the story of Samson and his unique weapon has deeper, more ancient roots than we thought. Based on the provided data, there exists a plausible hypothesis suggesting that for certain ancient cultures, the weapon of the sun god was represented by an ass's jawbone. This symbol subsequently may correlate with the emblematic representation of the thunderbolt. This interpretation is corroborated further by an important detail in the narrative linking the jawbone with the outpouring of waters. If one proceeds with the argument that the jawbone symbolizes the thunderbolt, it logically follows that its employment would be succeeded by rain. This notion finds artistic resonance in the work of Guido Reni. In his depiction of Samson quenching his thirst, Reni represents the water as emanating from above, with Samson elevating the jawbone overhead. The biblical narrative describes Samson's impassioned supplication, which, given its poetic cadence, could potentially be exacted from a preceding rendition. It can be postulated that in its archaic interpretation, this prayer was perceived not as a mere religious petition, as understood in contemporary times, but as an incantation of mystical properties. In the localization of the legend, a specific spring in the cavity of the rock of the jawbone has been designated as the source from which water emerged in response to Samson's invocation. Historical references, such as the account by Diodorus Siculus, Book 4:22, confirms such occurrences. Siculus narrates that as Heracles traveling from Pelurius to Eryx, nymphs facilitated the emergence of the warm springs, Hemiria and Aegistia, because he was so thirsty. Before delving further, it's imperative to underscore a linguistic nuance in Samson's victory proclamation. The term Camor dually signifies ass and heap. His triumphant exclamation is articulated as,
"With the jawbone of the Camor, ass, a Camor, heap, two Camors, heaps, with the jawbone of the Camor, ass, I slew 1,000 men."
In a nuanced rendition in the Polychrome Bible, Professor G.F. Moore adeptly translates the passage.
"With the jawbone of an ass, I assailed my assailants. With the jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men."
Additionally, the well is denoted as in Hekor, signifying the spring of the crier. Interestingly, this term also pertains to the patronage and, by extension, to the ass. The ass's distinct braying has traditionally been ascribed prophetic connotations in folklore, a belief that subsequently extended to the neighing of the horse. This association gains historical credence, recalling Herodotus's account where Darius's kingship is attributed to his horse's neighing. Biblical traditions such as Balaam's prophetic she-ass and extant traditions further suggest that both Yahweh and the war god Seth of the Semitic incursions in Lower Egypt were portrayed with the visage of an ass. An archaeological find within the confines of the historic Caesarean palace on Mount Palatine has unveiled a compelling illustration portraying a deity with the head of an ass crucified. This artwork, which bears the inscription of Alexmenos, has been traditionally dubbed the spot crucifix, derived from the German term spotten, meaning to scoff. This has led many to postulate that it was a mocking gesture directed at Alexmenos. However, when considered alongside leaden tablets that showcase similar ass-headed divine representations and bear incantations and maledictions, a different interpretation emerges. This spot crucifix could potentially depict the religious beliefs of the syncretic pagan Christian sect known as the Sethites. Tacitus in Histories 5:4 suggests that Jews venerated the ass. Furthermore, Epiphanius cites the genealogy of Mary, where the deity of the Jews is characterized as ass-headed, not in mockery, but as an actual representation. Professor W. Robertson Smith offers a comprehensive analysis regarding the significance of the ass within Semitic rituals.
The consumption of wild ass meat was a practice among the Arabs and likely bore religious significance, especially since its consumption was prescribed by Simeon the Stylite for his followers. In contrast, the Heranians viewed the ass as a taboo food source, kin to the swine and dog. Despite this, no evidence indicates the ass's ritualistic sacrifice or consumption. When one Semitic faction prohibits its consumption, while another deems it religiously symbolic, it strongly insinuates the ass's ancient sanctity. A clear instance of ass sacrifice is observed in the Egyptian Typhon, Set or Sutek worship, predominant among Semitic Egyptians. While scholars remain ambivalent about Set's Semitic origins, the ass is undoubtedly Typhonic. Religious rites in Coptus involve the ritualistic sacrifice of asses by hurling them off cliffs, whereas Lycopolis stamped sacrificial cakes with an ass motif during certain annual festivals, referenced in Plutarch.
Smith further elucidates.
The Semitic clan name Hamor, translating to he-ass, prevalent among the Canaanites of Shechem, strengthens the proposition of the ass's sacred stature among certain Semitic groups. Myths surrounding Jewish ass veneration, as detailed by Bochart and Harasokon, likely emerged from a conflation between Jewish practices and those of their pagan contemporaries.
In Greco-Roman mythology, Dionysus, often depicted in ancient artwork and reliefs, is shown amid his jovial entourage riding a donkey. A parallel can be drawn with Christ's iconic entrance into Jerusalem. In medieval Christian practices in southern France, the ass was held in high esteem, culminating in a unique mass where congregates would mimic ass braying instead of the conventional Amen. The ceremony concluded with a hymn, commencing with
Orientis partibus adventavit asinus.
The Latin phrase Orientis partibus adventavit asinus can be translated to English as, and forgive me if my Latin is wrong here, trying to understand this word.
From the eastern regions, the donkey has come.
This line is from a medieval Latin song that celebrates the donkey, as it's often referred to as the Song of the Ass. Multiple ancient sketches exist, showcasing deities with the head of a donkey. As per Plutarch, the ass or the crier held sacred connotations to Seth, predominantly due to the reddish hue often seen in its oriental variants. The Gates of Gaza. Ancient Babylonian cosmology posits that the sun god begins his daily traverse into the inhabited realm via two monumental pillars. This concept is deeply embedded in the archaeological traditions of Semitic temples. Remarkably, when the Jerusalem temple incorporated these two emblematic brazen pillars, though their original significance seems to have been obscured or forgotten in subsequent eras, maritime Phoenician culture, familiar with the geographical landscapes of their voyages, naturally perceived the two prominent rock formations at the Strait of Gibraltar as these sacred pillars. They viewed them as the symbolic gates through which Melqart, their deity, ventured as he embarked on his nocturnal journey to the underworld. It is Diodorus who provides historical commentary on this notion, stating in his writings
that Heracles put up the two mountains at the end of the Mediterranean, which have accordingly been called after him the Pillars of Hercules.
This nomenclature persisted until the era of Tariq. One might ponder the apparent geographical incongruence. How could pillars identified in the Eastern world also be replicated in the West, and vice versa? The interpretive resolution to this lies in the nightly transit of the sun god, who, according to mythological beliefs, transport these pillars between the two locations. In light of this mythic framework, Samson's seemingly inexplicable act takes on a profound dimension, being best understood not as a mere whimsical act, but as a manifestation of ancient mythological narratives. The solar mythology of Delilah's web. The narrative which illustrates how Samson was restrained in his subsequent liberation as though by a fervent blaze can be interpreted as elements of a solar myth. During winter, nature remains ensnared in ice, but as spring approaches, these shackles dissolve. This cyclical entrapment occurs again as winter's grip intensifies during the autumnal season. It is evident that the heroic figure, in this case Samson, escapes thrice before being irrevocably shackled. Upon Delilah's attempt to constrain her beloved, Samson revealed to her,
"If the 7 plates of my mane were interwoven within the fabric and solidified with the pin, I would be rendered powerless."
Though Delilah implemented this technique, Samson effortlessly
extricated the entire loom and its fabric.
Further observation indicates that the fabric, likely emblematic of Delilah's attempt, was dismantled and dispersed across the landscape. Recognizing Delilah and Samson as emblematic figures, and the strands of her loom symbolizing sun rays, the overarching connotation of the web becomes apparent. It represents the autumnal gossamer. This gossamer, occasionally referred to as Mary's thread, retains a somewhat nebulous origin, but it is believed to associate with the fabric of a prehistoric deity or fairy. The appearance of gossamer across terrains is an omen of impending winter. This signifies the sun's deity's final ensnarement, which he shatters. Soon after, the sorceress, representing the seasonal shift, would divest him of his radiant locks, thereby depleting his vigor. The story behind Samson's hair. Samson's loss of strength reveals a deeper symbolism, hinting at his connection to the sun. Just as Samson's hair is central to his power, the sun's rays can be thought of as the sun god's hair. In ancient texts like those of Homer, the sun god Apollo is described as having unshorn hair, a phrase which in Hebrew could be related to the term Nazir. Interestingly, Samson's hair is styled into 7 braids, reminiscent of how the sun god is depicted in some ancient artwork, like the Mithraic monuments, where the sun has 7 rays. These 7 rays might represent the influence of 7 planetary gods. The crux of Samson's story is when he loses his strength because Delilah cuts his hair. Delilah's name itself hints at a role. It can be translated as
the one who weakens or drains strength.
As the story progresses, Samson, symbolic of the sun, loses his sight, or light, and meets his end between 2 pillars in Gaza, which can be seen as the sun's setting, given Gaza's western position in the mentioned geography. The legend of the single eye. The German god Woden is famously depicted with just one eye, reflecting the single sun shining in our sky. There's an intriguing tale in Teutonic myths, which says that Woden traded his other eye to Mimer, the water god. This traded eye symbolizes the sun's reflections shimmering on the water's surface. Now, looking at another tale, when Samson in his dying moments speaks of seeking revenge for
one of my two eyes
against the Philistines, it gets interesting. Some versions of the story have translated it simply as
for my two eyes,
and interpretations like the one of Professor Moore in the Polychrome Bible suggest Samson implies his revenge can't fully compensate for his loss. However, we think the original tale had more depth and hinted at Samson being one-eyed, similar to Woden. His heartfelt plea seems to draw from ancient stories, echoing old-world traditions.
Adonai Yahweh, remember me, and give me strength once more, Elohim, to take revenge for one of my two eyes on the Philistines.
The passion and the unique rhyming in this poem are quite a rare find in Hebrew literary works. Samson's final act. Like the famous heroes Heracles and Melqart, Samson's end came by his own hands. Seen as a noble sacrifice, he willingly brought down the temple of Dagon, aiming to take down many of his people's tormentors along with him. Aware that the building was crowned with Philistine leaders, with just the rooftop holding 3,000 individuals, his actions implied a significant blow to the Philistines' power. While this act didn't entirely free the Israelites, it certainly weakened the Philistines' grip on them, fulfilling the prophecy that Samson would start the liberation of Israel from the Philistines. Mythical traits of Samson. The Samson myth in the Old Testament seems to be a remnant of ancient pagan traditions, giving its stark contrast to the dominant Puritan tone of later Judaism. While the biblical narrative is usually refined and moral, the story of Samson, full of humor and mischief, deviates. Its inclusion in the canon might be due to its popularity among the Israelites and its religious undertones. Indications suggest it emerged among herdsmen opposing local farmers and authorities. Despite its sometimes crude style and weak puns, its depiction of Yahweh as an unpredictable force, activated by external factors like Samson's hair, is reminiscent of pagan lore. This portrayal of the deity as a fickle force akin to the genie or Aladdin contrasts with the typical representation of Yahweh in a monotheistic context. The story's pagan undertones are unmistakable. The numerical significance of 7, 30, and 12 in ancient texts. The inclination toward mathematical interpretations, highly prevalent in Babylon, was not as evident among the ancient Hebrews. It is thus particularly intriguing to observe the preservation of figures such as 30, representative of the monthly days, and 7, signifying the weekly days, recurring within our narratives. For instance, 30 companions accompany Samson to his nuptials, and the same number appears as the stake for his riddle and corresponds to the Philistines he defeats at Ascalon. Moreover, Delilah employs 7 bowstrings to bind Samson, and his hair is fashioned into 7 braids. Roscoff's categorization of Samson's adventures into a set of 12 is of interest, yet its deliberate intention may be questionable, rendering it too ambiguous to be utilized as a foundational argument. The numerical value of 12 holds widespread significance in Eastern traditions. Numerous instances can be observed, such as the 12 tribes of Israel, even though tribe names vary occasionally, with the tribe of Dan occasionally substituted. The list extends to 12 prophets, Christ's 12 disciples, the zodiac's 12 segments, and the division of a day into 12 distinct periods. The reverence for the number 12 can be attributed in part to its mathematical versatility, being divisible by 2, 3, and 4. Moreover, it aligns with the 12 months of the annual cycle, leading to the conceptualization of the year's events as 12 expeditions of a celestial protagonist. Yet as narratives disseminate, their inherent meanings often become obscured. Consequently, tales like those of Heracles no longer mirror the son's annual journey, but transform into loosely linked episodes of bravery and prowess. The same evolution is evident in Samson's narrative, where potential real-life events and local influences intermingle with the primary myth, causing it to transition from a pure mythological narrative to a saga or legend. The symbolism of the lion and dragon in heroic narratives. In the renowned 12 labors of Heracles, one task involves the slaying of a lion. This act is emblematic of many Semitic solar heroes. It is particularly noteworthy that figures such as the Tyrian Melqart and the Babylonian Gilgamesh are depicted splitting a lion in half and vanquishing it weaponless, using only their hands, similar to the depiction of Samson in biblical accounts. In Greek depictions, the lion's pelt becomes a distinguishing attire for Heracles. Solar heroes from northern traditions often combat a creature or dragon representing marshlands and mists. This motif is evident in legends like Beowulf, the tale of Siegfried, and Thor's battle with the serpent Jormungandr. However, the Samson narrative lacks this dragon combat, suggesting its antiquity. This absence also insinuates that the Samson tale remains unadulterated by Aryan influences, preserving its Semitic essence. The Greek iteration of Heracles could either stem from an Aryan solar hero, akin to Siegfried, later infused with Semitic traits, or he might have been a Semitic solar hero subsequently adapted to Greek culture. Each of these solar champions becomes emblematic of their respective cultures, while Samson personified early and prehistoric Hebrew culture, contrasting the more refined later Judaic epochs. Heracles emerges as a quintessential Greek hero. The narrative of Samson, deeply embedded in Israelite culture, either originated within the community or was introduced at an ancient juncture. Given its age, any association with Babylonian myths would have been obscured over time. A fascinating distinction arises when comparing the expansive deeds of Heracles, a hero of a more globalized society seen as a universal savior, with the localized exploits of Samson. The latter is perceived as a liberator solely of the tribe of Dan, with all his significant actions limited to the tribe's geographical confines from his birth in Zorah to his demise in Gaza. Idzubar, Gilgamesh, the Helper. It remains uncertain if the Israelites ever venerated Samson as a demigod, guardian against adversaries and calamities. Our primary source is a narrative presented in the Book of Judges, as other potential evidence has been lost to history. Gilgamesh, akin to the Greek hero Heracles, is revered as a beacon of support during hardships. One fragment, enumerated as number 1371 by Smith and featured by Hopt in his Nimrod epos, encapsulates a prayer to Gilgamesh, portraying him as an aid to the sun god. In times of illness, his name was invoked for healing. The fragment depicts a patient seeking a priest's intervention, invoking Gilgamesh, the esteemed judge,
to whom the sun god has entrusted the scepter and decision.
The text then includes a partial hymn honoring Gilgamesh, with the priest later reciting,
O Gilgamesh, potent ruler, adjudicator of terrestrial spirits, eminent chief, prime overseer of humanity, surveyor of the world's regions, guardian of the earth, commander of terrestrial affairs, judicator with divine insight, traversing the earth, advancing towards justice. Your dominion remains steadfast. Your edict is unchallenged. You summon, rule, arbitrate, and discern. The sun god bestows upon you the scepter and judgment. Royalty and leaders revere you. Monitoring their edicts, you finalize their solutions. I am, offspring of, follower of, and illness plagues me, and I seek atonement. I beseech your wisdom to resolve my plight. Deliberate upon my case, extract the malady, triumph over the affliction, combat the ailment that wreaks havoc within me.
Subsequently, the priest assures the patient of the deity's compassion, hinting at a purification ritual or sacrament intended for the patient's recuperation. This fragment attests to Gilgamesh's deification, mirroring the trajectory of Heracles. Both are deemed judges and partners of the primary protector of righteousness, the sun god Shamash. The parallels between Heracles and Gilgamesh are widely accepted. Gilgamesh is often equated with Nimrod. It's plausible that features of the Gilgamesh narrative influenced the biblical Nimrod. Both are depicted as preeminent hunters, with their kingdoms rooted in
Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in Shinar.
The moniker Nimrod might signify bright light. Gilgamesh's name resonates with Mithras, a deity in Mazdaism, bearing resemblances to Christianity's Christ. Mithras, translated to splendor, with numerous aspects of Mithraistic lore, suggesting his representation as the sun and the blessings associated with it. Both the Gilgamesh epic and the Heracles myth grapple with the concept of immortality. While Gilgamesh appears to fall short in his quest for eternity, the subject remains central to the narrative. Conversely, Heracles surpasses all challenges, eventually ascending to Olympus, integrating into the realm of heavenly gods. The Zodiac's influence on the Gilgamesh tale. Ever wondered why the ancient tale of Gilgamesh has 12 parts? Many experts believe that the story mirrors the sun's journey through the 12 zodiac signs. In an old Assyrian document, Professor Sayce translated the month names of that time into English. Each month was linked to a zodiac sign and its associated symbol. For March, it's the sacrifice of righteousness. April has the propitious bull, and so on until February's sowing of seed. Occasionally, an extra month, the dark month of sowing, was added every 6 years. Now let's break down the Gilgamesh story. In the part, Gilgamesh is shown as a king, which is often compared to a ram in old texts. This fits the zodiac sign of Aries for March. Some ancient records even describe March as the sacrifice of righteousness, implying a ram offered as a sacrifice, much like how ancient Babylonians and Jews had significant offerings during this time. You can see the image right now showing you kind of an example of each month connecting to a zodiac. In the story's second part, a character named Enkidu, depicted as a walking bull, represents Taurus for April. The third part portrays the strong bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, symbolizing the twins, or Gemini, for May. The adventure continues with events in the story aligning with the zodiac signs of the months, from the Virgo representation in Gilgamesh's interactions with the goddess Ishtar to a scorpion man in November hinting at Sagittarius. Aquarius, for January, stands out. An old text speaks of a god lingering in the constellation of Gula. This zodiac sign often represents water, the images of a person pouring water or just a container. Interestingly, in the 11th part of the Gilgamesh story, there's a great flood narrated by Utnapishtim, who is akin to Noah from the Bible. But the story doesn't just end with a flood. Gilgamesh continues his quest, seeking wisdom about life and death, mirroring age-old beliefs about the afterlife. While some tablets of this epic are fragmented, making the full interpretation a bit tricky, the parallels between the story and the zodiac cycle are fascinating. The Gilgamesh tale not only entertains, but also offers a glimpse into ancient views on the cosmos and our place in it. Immortality. Samson, Heracles, and Gilgamesh. Each hero's myths tell us about ancient beliefs on life and death, but with some stark differences. Starting with Samson, his story stands apart from the other two. While many heroes in ancient myths venture into the underworld and return, Samson's tale ends with his demise. Heracles and Gilgamesh, on the other hand, share a similar thirst for immortality. Both go to great lengths in their respective quests. For instance, Gilgamesh, mourning the death of his close friend Enkidu, embarks on a journey to a place where no one returns. He's stopped at the coast by the Queen of the Sea, who tells him that only the sun god Shamash has ever sailed across the vast ocean. But Gilgamesh doesn't give up. With the help of a boatman named Arad Ea, he reaches the Isles of the Blessed. There, he communicates with Enkidu, who offers insights into the afterlife. He warns that some truths might be too unsettling, but assures Gilgamesh that souls receiving proper burial rites rest peacefully. Gilgamesh's journey further leads him to discover a life-renewing plant, though he unfortunately loses it to a serpent. Similarly, Heracles faces his share of challenges in his search for the life-giving apples of Hesperides. He needs to cross a vast ocean. With the sun god's favor lending him a boat, Heracles completes his quest. The endgame? After their adventures, both Gilgamesh and Heracles attain godlike statuses. But unlike them, Samson's story ends with his earthly life. In essence, these age-old tales reflect humanity's ageless quest for understanding life, death, and the potential of the hereafter. Dr. Paul goes into several other areas of mythical comparison. This was all published in 1907, and our philology has come a long way in understanding the names of characters. Much of what he said is thought-provoking, and I'm not really certain all of the connections he makes are certain, or if they're coincidental. But it really is cool to go back in time a little and hear what some scholars thought when it came to Samson. Dr. Carus goes on to explain how he sees Samson's story was cleaned up by a later scribe. They removed his resurrection scene. Samson is another solar deity who should always have a resurrection or ascension to the heavens as the sun always returns. He covers the descent of Dionysus to the underworld, the Phoenician Melqart, Osiris, Siegfried the German hero, Buddha, Jesus as one who enters the temple which would be destroyed as Samson destroyed the temple of Dagon, and how both Samson and Jesus were made to spectacle by their enemies. And of course he compares Samson and Heracles in more depth. Many of the statements he makes for the extremely ancient aspects of the Samson myth, I find personally, Derek Lambert on MythVision, could easily be reasoned to actually have come after the more mythical counterparts. The further back we look pertaining to the myths, there was far less rationalizing of the stories. While there probably was a much more mythical version of Samson, the story we see in our Bibles tends to give off a very euhemerized flavor. This tends to make me see a late Persian, early Hellenistic period for its final version. However, I want to take us into the future because you might be surprised to find that experts in the field actually see excellent reasons to compare Samson to Heracles. In fact, these two characters are so closely comparable that it would seem a bit ridiculous not to think one is influencing the other. Biblical literalists who demand Samson is historical still need to face the monsters of Melqart and Gilgamesh. But for this documentary, I suggest that the author of Samson took notes from the Greek Heracles, even if Heracles was initially a Semitic import of Gilgamesh into the Greek culture.
The Legends of Samson Heracles, 1987.
Now I turn to Dr. Othniel Margolith's work on Samson, which compares Heracles and Samson in depth. Let's dive in, my friends. Heroic submission to female power. Many scholars have drawn attention to the thematic parallels between Heracles' subjugation by Deianira and Samson's entrapment by Delilah. Nonetheless, a closer scrutiny reveals that this association may be more superficial than profound. Overlooking the intrinsic dynamics of each narrative, in the biblical context, Delilah emerges as a conniving figure, profiting from her deceit. Contrastingly, Deianira is portrayed as an unwitting agent of tragedy, whose inadvertent actions spring from the genuine affection and culminate in her tragic self-destruction. A more appropriate parallel for Delilah might be figures such as Scylla or Cometho. A recurring theme across mythologies is the hero's diminishment or emasculation due to female machinations. Another episode from Heracles' life illustrates this. his subordination under Queen Omphale. Similarly, Samson's dalliance with Delilah leads to a symbolic representation of his power being constrained, as suggested by the biblical verse, "Awaked out of his sleep and went away with the pin of the beam and with the web." Judges 16:13-14. Such imagery resonates with the societal perceptions of weaving as a feminine domain, Penelope in Greek mythology, and underscores the hero's demeaning position. This is further intensified by the Deuteronomistic injunction against men donning female attire, Deuteronomy 22:5. Analyzing the biblical narrative, one encounters inconsistencies. Samson recurrently finds himself in compromising positions, oblivious to the lurking Philistines. Given the spatial limitations of dwelling from the era, as deduced from archaeological excavations, typically 2 rooms measuring approximately 9 by 12 feet, Samson's repetitive oversight seems implausible. The narrative reaches its crescendo with Samson's hair, the source of his strength, being cut while he rests on Delilah's lap. A comparable scenario unfolds in Greek mythology. Heracles, under the influence of Queen Omphale, is depicted in a subjugated role, engaging in traditionally feminine tasks, only to later break free from this enchantment. A consistent motif in both narratives is the hero's ability to effortlessly break physical restraints. In the biblical account, Samson, though bound, breaks free and proceeds to vanquish a multitude, as evidenced in Judges 15:13-15. A parallel can be drawn with Heracles, who, when ensnared by Pharaoh's minions and led to be sacrificed, overpowers them in a display of his unparalleled strength. This is noted in Apollodorus. The mighty club. Samson in biblical lore utilizes a seemingly rudimentary weapon, an ass's jawbone he randomly finds on a mountain peak, Judges 15:9-6. The narrative emphasizes the spontaneous choice of this tool, much like how Heracles from Greek mythology transforms an olive sapling into a formidable weapon. While the mighty club theme is prevalent in myths, including Canaanite stories, its representation varies. In Canaanite tales, the clubs Baal uses to overpower Yam are uniquely different from those wielded by Samson and Heracles. Baal's clubs are intricately crafted by the deity Cathor and Hasis and possess inherent divine magic. The power of these clubs stems from their enchantment, not from the extraordinary might of their handler. This is a stark contrast to Samson and Heracles, who impressively wield everyday items with superhuman strength, rendering them lethal. Heracles, in particular, is known to use his olive sapling not just as a weapon, but also as a multi-purpose tool, even fashioning an oar from a tree. In the same vein, Samson's utilization of the jawbone extends beyond combat. He employs it to unearth a water source. Judges 15:17-19. Interestingly, similar motifs of characters using natural objects with unmatched strength have persisted across cultures in time. By the 12th century, Central Europe had legends of figures with the capability to uproot trees, as seen in various art forms and locations like Pécs, Remagen, Alsbach, Limburg, and Mainfeld. In essence, the tales of Samson and Heracles offer a fascinating study in how mythological heroes can imbue ordinary items with extraordinary power, in contrast to tales where the power is inherent in the object itself. Samson and Heracles destroy lions barehanded. In a concise account, the biblical narrative recounts an unparalleled feat by Samson, wherein he tears apart a lion with his own hands. Judges 14:5-6. Although figures like David and Benaiah ben Jehoiada are credited with lion slayings, 1 Samuel 17, 2 Samuel 23, 1 Chronicles 11, respectively, the term slew suggests the use of weapons, Notably, in various artworks from Assyria and Egypt, divinities or kings are often depicted dispatching lions. However, these portrayals typically showcased armed hunters. The distinguishing features of the Samson and Heracles tales are they are unarmed combats, and the events tied to matrimonial endeavors. Such a narrative, vanquishing a lion without weaponry within matrimonial contexts, is unprecedented in the Bible, Canaanite, and Mesopotamian mythos. Yet, in Greek mythology, there are parallels. Admetos tamed a lion without arms to win Alcestis' hand. Orion subdued wild beast for Eros' hand. Pylus strangled a lion to win Cucnus' favor. Certain stories magnify these feats, transforming lions into monstrous creatures. For instance, Oedipus outwitted the lion-formed Sphinx with only words to wed the queen. Bellerophon defeated the lion-faced Chimera prior to marrying Philonoe. Heracles, to win over Thespius' 50 daughters, choked a lion at Cytherion without weapons. A variant tale claims Alcetus killed this lion to wed Megara. Heracles' triumph over the Nemean lion is notable, as he did so with nothing in his hands, which mirrors Judges 14:6. Though the biblical narrative contains internal inconsistencies, it shouldn't be interpreted strictly as a historical record. For instance, discrepancies exist in Samson's interactions with the woman in Timnath and the role of his parents. These inconsistencies have prompted various interpretations, ranging from the suggestion that the story is a composite of multiple tells to the idea that listeners and readers of that era weren't perturbed by such contradictions, understanding the tale as legend, not factual history. Central to this legend is the motif of a hero en route to his wedding, traditionally overcoming a fierce beast without any tools or weapons. This image emphasizes the link to other legends where bridegrooms, weaponless, defeat lions, distinguishing them from the other lion slayers like David.
The mythological parallels of gates and pillars.
The narrative of Samson is riddled with curious tales, one of which portrays him transporting the doors of the Gaza city gate, along with their supporting posts, atop his shoulders to a hill near Hebron, Judges 16:3. Archaeological evidence dispels the possibility of this being a literal city. The city gates unearthed from the period typically comprise two monolithic posts dovetailed with massive monolithic lintels and thresholds upon which a significant portion of the wall depended. To remove the gate doors, with their bar and all, one would need to detach the lintel, inevitably collapsing the city wall. These seemingly fantastical narratives often serve etiological functions, elucidating the etymology of certain places or heroes. A hallmark of these tales is their conclusion with phrases like, "and they named it him." However, the tale of Gaza's city gates lacks this characteristic denouement and doesn't seem to be rooted in etiology. It leaves readers puzzled about Samson's intentions in transporting the gates and his subsequent actions upon reaching the hill. Given that the narrative includes the posts, one can surmise that Samson perhaps erected them on the hill. Thus, the evocative image of the hero positioning a city gate's doorposts on a summit with doors draped over his shoulders likely forms the core of this legend. Strikingly, this imagery resonates with Greek lore, specifically with Heracles, who guarded the Olympus gates and often held them open for tardy deities. Both Samson and Heracles have mythological associations with pillars. Samson is depicted amidst two foundational pillars in Dagon's temple, and Heracles is shown establishing his iconic pillars The Samson account mentions a gathering of thousands atop the temple roof, which remains archaeologically unfounded, as no infrastructure from that era could accommodate such a crowd, especially not with dual central posts. These descriptions instead evoke the renowned frescoes from Knossos' palace, where two pillars often frame sanctuaries, and throngs of observers populate palace terraces. This context also gives rise to the image of Heracles, brandishing a pillar in each hand. Riddles. The story of the riddle is as integral to the legend of Samson as the tale of the torch-tailed foxes. Like the latter, it poses several questions due to its inconsistency with the biblical world. However, unlike the fox's story, many of these questions have already been raised and discussed, and can be summarized as, is the riddle a common literary form in the Bible, or is this instance unique? Does the riddle qualify as a riddle within the definition of this literary form? In what language or common terms of communication did Samson and his listeners converse? It's essential to determine if the word riddle used in the story correctly translates the term hid. The word hid appears 9 times in the Bible, 8 of which suggest it pertains to aphorisms not demanding an answer, such as Solomon and the Queen of Sheba's interaction. Various references in Habakkuk, Psalms, Proverbs, Daniel, and Numbers. In these instances, the King James Bible translates them as dark sayings, proverb, or similar terms. Only in Samson's story does a riddle genuinely mean a question and answer format, a literary form otherwise unknown in the Bible. True riddles rely on the listener already possessing the knowledge of the answer, even if it's not at the forefront of their mind. An inquiry outside the listener's knowledge isn't a riddle, as guessing its meaning or answer is impossible. Samson's riddle's answer was bees hive in a lion's carcass and produce honey, a concept frequently disputed as bees don't typically reside in carcasses. While some argue this might have been a one-time event, others assert that the riddle wasn't solvable without knowing specific circumstances. Additionally, some interpretations and translations around carcasses and insects have been debunked. Thus, in its presented form, Samson's riddle doesn't fit the traditional understanding of a riddle. Attempts have been made to explain this paradox by discarding the concept of riddle and interpreting the story as part of the mythological cycle related to a sun hero. This cycle can be traced back to ancient mythology. The classical myth, most frequently referenced in relation to Samson's bees hiving in a lion's carcass, is the tale by Virgil concerning Aristeus, the son of the nymph Cyrene by Apollo. When Aristeus's bees left him, he made sacrifices to Zeus, who in turn sent him a new swarm. Some also refer to the story of Onisilus, in whose skull bees made their hive, Herodotus 5:114. A discrepancy arises in these accounts. The Greek myths referred to a skull or an ox's carcass, while the Bible mentions a lion. This distinction was rationalized by Stan, who suggested that both myths deal with sun heroes. Since both the ox and the lion are revered by the sun god, the two narratives can be seen as parallels. This argument seems circular. The solar attributes of the ox and the lion are selectively emphasized, while others are disregarded. These links are then used as evidence that both tales are sun myths and both protagonists are sun heroes. Sidestepping the main issue, the critical inquiry should be about the cultural context of Samson's riddle. What common folk tales and traditions did both Samson and the Philistines know that contained the answer? Bees hiving in a carcass. It's unlikely such a myth sprouted in Mesopotamian culture, as they lacked beekeeping practices. This is supported by an inscription from Shamash Resh Usur, the governor of Mari in the 18th century BCE. who bragged about introducing beekeeping to his nation. However, indications of this culture were sparse, suggesting limited success. While the Hittites and the Egyptians recognized the bee, it held no place in their myths. Conversely, Greek myths frequently associate bees with carcasses and often attribute significance to bees. The Cretan Zeus was cared for in childhood by the daughters of Melicius, a bee god. Additionally, Melissa was the title given to priestesses of Artemis, Ceres, and Delphi. The Philistines, with roots in the Minoan Mycenaean world, would likely know the tale of Aristeus and bees swarming a carcass. It's essential to realize that for Samson to form a riddle around this association, he too would have to be acquainted with it. Moreover, those who passed on these early narratives and their audience had to know this story. Otherwise, the entire tale would make no sense to them, as it would contradict natural occurrences. They also needed to recognize the literary form called riddle, akin to the renowned Greek riddle posed by the Sphinx to Oedipus. Although everyone knew the answer, only Oedipus made the connection. In summary, the narrator and listeners, the compiler of biblical tales, and the editor had to be versed in this particular literary style, which is rare in the Bible, as well as familiar with the Aristeus myth. Wajdenbaum noted that the tribe of Dan, where Samson belonged, communicated in terms, concepts, myths, and beliefs shared with the Philistines and recognized by later generations of Israelites. The shared language might be what Nehemiah criticized when he remarked that the returned exiles in Judea and their offspring spoke half in the speech of Ashdod, Nehemiah 13:24. Another integral part of the legend of Samson is the story of his magic locks, which granted him supernatural abilities. This power, intrinsically linked with the locks, vanished when they're cut and reappeared with their regrowth. Samson's own words clarify this. "If I be shaven, I shall become weak and be like any man." Judges 16:17. When the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven, 16:22. "He prays and strengthened me only this once," 16:28. And the returned strength enabled him to topple a temple large enough to host 3,000 people on its roof. From the statement, "I shall become like any man," it's evident that both he and the biblical storyteller, as well as the audience, perceive Samson as more than human. This is reminiscent of Adam and Eve's potential superhumanity upon consuming the forbidden fruit. That in the day ye eat thereof, ye shall be as gods. Genesis 3:5. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us. 3:22. The Bible emphasizes Samson's exceptional nature, detailing his divine conception and his status as a Nazir. Judges 13:5. Yet commentators note that Samson's life starkly contrasts the Nazir as described in Numbers 6:2-19. Even traditional rabbinical sources like Radak acknowledge the unusual aspect of Samson regaining his powers despite being defiled by carcasses, which seems to contradict his Nazirite status. To better understand, let's compare the main points of the Nazir's rules with Samson's life. Let's take a look at this side-by-side graph between Numbers 6 and Judges 13-16. On the left, the Nazir is an adult who decides to abstain from certain things for a defined period. On the right, the Lord's angel designates the unborn child to be a Nazir until his death. Again, Numbers 6:3. The Nazir must abstain from consuming vine products and avoid defilement by carcasses. On the right, the Nazir's mother must abstain from vine products and avoid defilement by unclean entities. On the left, if defiled, the Nazir shaves his nezer, hair, forelock, lets it grow back. This act doesn't affect his abilities or status. On the right, consumption of honey from a carcass defiles him, but no purification is needed. Cutting the Nazir takes away the Nazir's powers and status. Numbers 6:18-19. At the decided period's conclusion, the Nazir shaves the Nezer and offers it to God, ceasing to be a Nazir. On the right, the re-emergence of the Nezer restores his remarkable powers and status. He is destined to be a Nazir until his demise. From the biblical records, it appears that the traditions of number 6 weren't strictly followed in Israel. For example, Amos 2:11-12 indicates Nazirs were told to avoid wine, but there's no mention of their hair or any supernatural strength. The Rechabites' wine abstinence in Jeremiah 35 isn't associated with the Nazirim, and although they abstained from birth like Samson, hair cutting isn't referenced. Meanwhile, Jeremiah 7:29 cites the growing of Nazir as a mere secular tradition, with the term Nazir metaphorically used for vine shoots in Leviticus 25. The term generally denotes flowing locks in biblical mentions. It also refers to the crown of the high priest, Exodus 29:6, and the king, 2 Samuel 1, Psalms 132, 2 Kings 11, Psalms 89. There isn't a specific instance in the Bible where a vow of abstinence is taken while growing a Nezer, or to offer it as a sacrifice. However, it can be inferred that such customs existed, or else the laws in number 6 would lack context. The account of Absalom's annual haircutting and its valuation at 200 shekels, 2 Samuel 14:26, might hint at such a sacrificial practice. Kaufman's proposal that Judges 5:2 pertains to a tradition of growing a Nazir as part of a warrior purification and dedication is questionable. He cites Samson as proof, then employs the same argument to label Samson as a dedicated warrior. The claim about Samuel, "There shall no razor come on his head," 1 Samuel 1:11, and "as long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord," 1:28, doesn't clearly indicate his Nazirite status or adherence to relevant rituals. This aligns with the biblical portrayal of Samson, who celebrates with the Philistines for 7 days, Judges 14:10, 12, and 17, consumes honey from a lion's carcass, 14:8-9, and interacts with the bodies of those he's killed, 14:9, 15:15, without needing to shave his Nazir as mandated in number 6. In fact, he mustn't shave it, as doing so would strip him of his extraordinary abilities. From this, it's evident the author's intent wasn't to narrate the story of a Nazirite as outlined in number 6. Instead, it tells of an individual adorned with a miraculous Nazir of hair, distinct from other biblical references, granting him superhuman powers as long as it wasn't cut. Even Kaufman concedes that the story's aim is to depict a remarkable individual, reminiscent of ancient legendary heroes, whose magical prowess was linked to their uncut locks. Hence, Samson's questionable actions are overlooked as long as they don't threaten his hair. Biblically, the concept of a hero with superhuman attributes is unique. Other figures like Joshua, David, Joab, Gideon, and even Saul, who, when he stood among the people, was higher from his shoulders and upward, 1 Samuel 10:23, are portrayed as merely human, while adversaries like Goliath, measuring 6 cubits and a span, 1 Samuel 17:4, his kin with 24 fingers and toes, 1 Chronicles 20, verse 6, and Og of Bashan with the bed 9 cubits in length, Deuteronomy 3:11, are depicted as extraordinary. They aren't superhuman. Even the narrative of Moses raising his hand, enabling Israel to defeat enemies at Rephidim, Exodus 17:11, doesn't parallel the wondrous hair of Samson. The concept of magic hair is unfamiliar in Eastern mythology. Although in Mari, there was the belief that a lock of a man's hair and the corner of his cloak, if possessed by another man, would grant the latter magical power to harm its owner. This is significantly different from the idea that uncut magical hair bestows superhuman strength upon its bearer. However, this motif can be identified in Greek mythology. Number 1. Nessus, the king of Megara, remained unbeatable as long as his magical hair was undamaged. But when his daughter Scylla, infatuated with his foe King Minos, sliced him during his sleep, his might disappeared, leading to his capture by Minos. Number 2. Terelos, king of Teleboe and a grandson of Poseidon, was rendered immortal due to his magical hair. His daughter Cametio, enamored with his enemy King Amphitryon, trimmed his hair, bringing about his downfall. Polydorus 2:4-7. Legend states that during Amphitryon's distraction, Zeus had a romantic night with the queen, prolonging it by halting the sun and moon, leading to the birth of Heracles. Number 3. Apollo's titles, golden-haired and never shorn, Homer, Iliad 20:39, are explicit and signify the sacred significance of this embellishment, as does the tradition where Poseidon bestows it upon his grandson Terelos. Number 4. A less familiar tale about Heracles mentions him losing both his bushy hair and his mystical powers after being consumed by a well, where he remained for 3 days. Lycophron Alexander 36-7. Coincidentally, the parallel biblical tale of a hero inside a well for 3 days is located in Jaffa, the city of Perseus, Heracles' great-grandfather, and Andromeda, which is in the heart of Philistia. Recent excavations nearby have unearthed a Mycenaean-type temple showcasing the cultural connections of the Philistines with Mycenae. Number 5. The iconic depiction of Heracles donning the maned head of a Nemean lion, resembling a helmet of wild-growing hair, might stem from his efforts to conceal his baldness. Polydorus 2:4-10. Euripides' Madness of Heracles. Number 6. The incognito god Dionysus, when threatened by King Pentheus with having his hair cut, resorted to, "My hair is sacred, my locks are divine." Euripides' Bacchae 494-6. The tradition of letting one's hair grow after taking an oath and then offering it to a deity is cited by Herodotus 434. He states that young men would cut and offer their hair to Apollo on Delos as a coming-of-age rite, similar to the legends of the foxes, referenced as note earlier on. And the riddle, the tale of Samson's locks, represent a theme not originating from Canaanite or West Semitic mythological concepts, but from the Minoan Mycenaean realm. This narrative, like the others, was likely borrowed from the Philistines by the Danites and incorporated into their tribal narratives.
A divine father.
Let's connect the dots back to something suggested at the beginning with Dr. Yair Zakovitch, and now with Dr. Othniel Margalith, pertaining to Samson's parentage, and tie that into other myths. The narrative of Samson's conception and birth, Judges 13:2-24, encompasses elements typical to myths regarding the birth of heroes: the sterile mother, the intervention of a supernatural, often divine entity, and the ensuing miraculous birth. There are various such tales in the Bible. An angel informs Abraham, "I shall return to you in due season, and lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son." Now Abraham and Sarah were old. Sarah no longer had her menstrual periods, so Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, "Now that I am worn out and my husband is old, will I have pleasure?" The Lord then asks Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, and Sarah shall have a son." Genesis 18:10-14. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time God had stated. Genesis 21:1-2. From the beginning of this narrative, the Lord appeared to Abraham, Genesis 17:1, and from 17:15, and God said to Abraham. It is evident that this is a theophany. Verse 19's God said, "Sarah your wife shall bear unto you a son," presents both a divine foretelling and assurance. In 18:4, the speaker unmistakably refers to himself with, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This is clearly a miraculous birth through a divine act against nature's laws. In Genesis 25:21, Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife, Rebekah, conceived. There's no indication that Isaac played a role in this conception. Rachel, too, was barren, Genesis 29:31. Unlike the former cases, Jacob was capable of impregnating his wife, yet he exclaims, "Am I in God's place?" God's intervention was needed for Joseph's birth, but not for Benjamin's. Within mythological thought, it's common to attribute divine paternity to the fathers of the nation, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and miraculous conception to their mothers. Genesis 6:2 and 4 speaks of entire generations of demigods. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair and took them as wives. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God cohabited with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. The term cohabited implies sexual relations, and also afterward indicates that such heroes were not limited to one generation. It's noteworthy that even in medieval times, traditional commentators generally accepted this concept. In addition to the patriarchs, such legends were associated with other heroes, including the stories of Hannah and Manoah's wife. Hannah's story, 1 Samuel 1:2, is akin to Rachel's. In it, Hannah, like Rachel, is barren until divine intervention. Many commentators believe Hannah's tale was originally about King Saul's birth. With an evident etiological intent, the narrative suggests divine paternity and miraculous conception for the nation's first king, a motif familiar in ancient mythology, contrasting with the portrayal of the final judge. In light of this context, we can comprehend the statement of Manoah's wife, who was barren and did not bear, Judges 13:2. When she says to her husband, "A man of God came to me," in verse 6, to, quote, "come to," end quote, a woman in the Bible denotes cohabitation, as demonstrated in the tales of Hagar, the progenitor of the Ishmaelites, Genesis 16:4. Lot's daughters, who are the foremothers of Moab and Ammon, Genesis 19:31-32. Leah and Rachel, 29:23-30-31. And Bilhah, 30, verse 3. The matriarchs of the Israelite tribes, Bathshua and Tamar, Genesis 38, 2-3, 8-9, 15-18. Founders of the Judahite family, and Bathsheba, the mother of the Davidic dynasty, 2 Samuel 11, 4-5, 12-24. Aholabah and Aholah, representing Judah and Israel, Ezekiel 23:44. And the, quote, neighbor's wife, end quote, Proverbs 6:29-32. This term is utilized similarly in the account of Samson and the prostitute from Gaza, Judges 16:1-3. Historically, readers and narrators interpreted Manoah's wife's story in this manner. Notably, after their second meeting, Manoah himself perceived his wife's words in this light. Quote, "Look, the man that visited me the other day," end quote, verse 10. Furthermore, Manoah was unaware of the visitor's extraordinary identity. Quote, "Came to the man and asked, 'Are you the man?' He replied, 'I am,' end quote, verse 11. Quote, "For Manoah did not know he was an angel of the Lord," end quote, verse 16. The titles, quote, "man of God," end quote, and messenger of God did not inherently suggest a supernatural essence. And it was only after witnessing the theophany in verses 21-22 that Manoah grasped the divine identity of the guests. Thus, the narrative underscores the tale of a divine entity in human form cohabiting with a woman, resulting in the birth of a child. This child then joins the ranks of the, quote, men of old, men of renown, end quote, previously mentioned. This idea, prevalent in ancient times and rooted in Canaanite mythology, is emphasized in how Josephus recounts the story, reflecting the perceptions of his era. His version suggests that Manoah doubted his wife's fidelity with a stranger. The narrator and the audience recognized that the visitor did more than just announce. While the biblical narrator aims to demythologize the tales of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Hannah, presenting divine intervention as a miracle, his portrayal in the Samson story is stark, realistic, and almost pagan. Consequently, the Samson narrative stands out from the rest, showcasing a realistic perspective towards the mysterious forces. This perspective diverges from the Canaanite tradition, where the children of El by a mortal woman are deemed gods, namely Shakar and Shalem. While Samson remains human, nevertheless, this aligns closely with Greek mythology, where gods frequently parent human heroes without much ado. The myth of Samson, the mortal son of a divine father and a Danite woman, is mirrored by the tales of a divine father and a Danaid mother, which come in two versions. A. Heracles was born when Zeus approached Alcmene, the wife of Amphitryon and granddaughter of Perseus, the Danaid. B. Perseus came into existence when Zeus approached Danae, the daughter of Acrisius and the great-granddaughter of Danaus, who is the namesake of the Danaans. Moreover, several legends about these two Greek heroes have biblical parallels. Acrisius, Danae's father, grappled with his twin brother in their mother's womb, similar to Jacob, Dinah's father, Genesis 25:22-26, and Perez, Genesis 38:28-30. Perseus, the Danaid, traveled to Egypt, then Jaffa, by saving the Ethiopian princess Adramydia. He then became the king of this city. This tale corresponds with the recent discovery of a significant Philistine city and the tribe of Dan, originating from Egypt, which settled in the vicinity of Jaffa. To ease Zeus's interactions with Alcmene, Hermes, following Zeus's command, made the sun and moon stand still, a story that reminds one of Joshua's achievements at Ajalon, Joshua 10:12-13. Within the domain of the Dan tribe, Joshua 19:43. The origins of these tales seem to trace back to Mycenae, and they subsequently became a shared cultural legacy of the Greeks in the Aegean region. Dan was not born to the primary mother of the nation, but a maid, similar to Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. However, unlike them, he was born, quote, on Rachel's knees, end quote, Genesis 33, making him Rachel's son, quote, and she shall bear upon my knees that I may have children by her, verse 3. And Rachel said, God hath judged me and hath also heard my voice and hath given me a son, end quote. Birth on someone's knees in antiquity symbolized the act of adoption, and it was a familiar custom among the Hittites and continued until recent times in Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, regions that were part of the ancient Greek world. The Bible provides several examples of such adoptions. Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh, and now thy two sons Ephraim and Manasseh are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Genesis 48:5-6. And Joseph brought them out from between his, Jacob's, knees. Verse 12. Joseph adopts Machir's children. The children also of Machir, son of Manasseh, were born upon Joseph's knees. Genesis 50:23. And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom, and her neighbors gave it a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi. Ruth 4:16-17. It's commonly believed that these stories intended to explain why Ephraim and Manasseh received portions equal to Jacob's sons, and why Manasseh had two portions, one on each side of the Jordan. The story of Ruth's son signifies his adoption by a Judean mother, making him, and crucially his descendant David, a legitimate member of the tribe of Judah, despite having a Moabite mother. This would have been problematic as per Deuteronomy 23 verse 4. Interestingly, a preserved story of adoption positions Dan as the legal firstborn of Rachel, making him equal with Judah, who rose in rank after Jacob's disapproval of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi in Genesis 49. Only the rule in Deuteronomy 21, 15, and 17 challenges his top rank. Notably, there's a similar legend about Heracles, who after emerging from between Hera's knees was adopted and became a fully recognized member of his father's family. At first glance, the account of Manoah's sacrifice, Judges 13, 16 through 22, appears as a simple narrative of a miraculous sacrifice. However, upon closer examination, it stands out from stories like that of Gideon, Judges 6:21. In Gideon's narrative, a magical fire ignited by the touch of the Lord's angel emanates from a rock to consume the sacrifice, after which the angel disappears. In contrast, for Manoah, the fire is naturally lit by a human, verse 19, and amidst its flames, the man, who is the hero's father, ascends to heaven, as observed, and Manoah and his wife looked on it. And Manoah said unto his wife, "We have seen God." This depicts the vision of a divine figure ascending through the flames, revealing his divine nature, a theophany as expressed by Manoah, for we have seen God. Such a theophany is neither found in the Bible nor in Canaanite legends, but is present in the tales of Heracles. In these tales, Heracles concludes his life on a pyre ignited by his son, ascending amidst the flames to offer a magnificent spectacle. Although the Greek legend showcases the hero's theophany witnessed by his son, while the Samson narrative focuses on the hero's father, this difference doesn't undermine the story's similarity. Myths are known to be attributed differently across time, places, and characters within the same narrative cycle, such as fathers and sons. The Bible provides several examples. The narrative involving Abraham, Sarah, and Pharaoh in Genesis 12, 10 through 20 is repeated with Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelech in Genesis 20. Yet in Genesis 26, 6 to 11, it concerns Isaac, Rebekah, and Abimelech. The story narrated about Elijah in 1 Kings 17, 14 through 16 is mirrored in Elisha's story in 2 Kings 4, 1 through 7. Similarly, the resurrection of the child, 1 Kings 17, 18 through 23, and 2 Kings 4, 17 through 21, 32 through 36, and the tales about the purification of the water, 2 Kings 2, 19 through 22, and the stew, 2 Kings 4, 38 through 41, are variations of the same theme. Thus, the episode of Samson's ancestor ascending to the heavens amidst the altar flames could be seen as a parallel to Heracles' ascent to Olympus through the pyre flames on Mount Ota, observed by his son.
It's obviously from Heracles.
Dr. Philippe Wajdenbaum, 2011, and Russell Gmirkin, 2017. Another fun read is the 2011 book Argonauts of the Desert by Philippe Wajdenbaum, where he covers endless examples of parallels to the Greek world and the Bible. He highlights how most scholars want to highlight parallels to Orientalist sources rather than to Greek ones. Russell Gmirkin, in his book Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, 2017, takes aim at this problem, highlighting shared literary and legal traditions which need explaining on how they appear in the biblical texts. Here's a summary of what he says on page 3 in that book. In the study of ancient legal systems, scholars have observed connections between Greek and biblical legal traditions. This posed a challenge to the prevailing belief that the biblical law collections predated Greek influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Comparisons between Greek and Jewish historical narratives, prophetism, and cultural institutions also raised difficulties. Consequently, scholars developed strategies to explain Greek legal and literary features in biblical texts before the Hellenistic period. Typological parallels between Greek and Jewish traditions were increasingly criticized in comparative studies. Scholars began to emphasize the methodological validity of comparison only when cultures or literatures were geographically close and temporarily proximate, allowing for direct or mediated flows of ideas. However, this approach faced challenges when applied to Greek comparative studies because it restricted possible influences to a historical period before Alexander the Great's conquest and significant Greek-Jewish interactions. To address the issue of apparent Greek influences on biblical writings before Greek arrival in the East, scholars proposed various explanations. One common solution was to suggest the existence of intermediary groups that transmitted Greek ideas to the East, such as Greek and Cretan troops with King David, or Greek mercenaries in the Negev. Others proposed included Phoenicians or Philistines as intermediaries. However, the idea of direct interactions between the educated elites of the Greek and Jewish worlds before Alexander's conquests, or the transmission of Greek writings to Jewish readers through intermediaries, was not seriously considered as a feasible channel for the exchange of complex legal and literary traditions. An alternative approach was offered by legal scholar Raymond Westbrook, who hypothesized the existence of a shared Eastern Mediterranean legal culture encompassing Greek, Roman, Hittite, Babylonian, Assyrian, and biblical legal traditions. Westbrook argued that despite geographical distance, these regions were part of the same historical stream. Although Westbrook's theory faced criticism, it encouraged ongoing research into shared legal traditions, adopted by some biblical researchers engaging in comparative studies with Greek legal materials. A significant criticism of Westbrook's theory was its reliance on the assumption of shared Greek and biblical legal traditions dating back to archaic times, which might have actually emerged in Hellenistic-era biblical literature, creating a circular argument. While the convergence of Greek and biblical legal elements is accepted today, the mechanism for this shared tradition and the timing of Greek influence on the biblical authors remain subjects of debate. The reference to the Temple of Heracles, Melqart at Tyre, in approximately 175 BCE, as documented in 2 Maccabees 4:18-20, provides a valuable historical marker illuminating the Hellenistic milieu within which certain biblical narratives were situated. 2 Maccabees 4:18-20. On the occasion of the quadrennial games at Tyre in the presence of the king, the vile Jason sent an embassy of the Antiochists from Jerusalem, taking with them 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. But even those who brought the money did not think it would be right to spend it on the sacrifice and decided to reserve it for some other item of expenditure. And so what the sender had intended for the sacrifice to Hercules was in fact applied at the suggestion of those who brought it to the construction of Triremes. This passage details an event where Jason, operating as a representative of the Antiochists from Jerusalem, sought to allocate 300 silver drachmas for the purpose of offering a sacrifice to Hercules during the quadrennial games at Tyre, held in the presence of the king. However, an intriguing twist in the narrative emerges as the individuals entrusted with the funds reconsidered their allocation, ultimately redirecting them towards the construction of Triremes. This episode serves as a testament to the interplay of Hellenistic cultural influences, financial priorities, and political dynamics in the region. Notably, this episode also underscores the architectural parallels between the Temple of Melqart in Tyre and the Jewish temple, both featuring prominent pillars. Subsequently, during the Maccabean War, as narrated in 1 Maccabees 10:82-85, the Temple of Dagon in Ashdod, known as Azotus in Greek, another pivotal religious site in the region, was razed by Simon Maccabee, 1 Maccabee 10, 82 through 85. Simon sent his own troops into attack against the phalanx, which he cut to pieces and routed. The cavalry scattered over the plain and fled to Azotus, where they took sanctuary in Beth Dagon, the temple of their idol. Jonathan, however, set fire to Azotus and the surrounding towns, plundered them, and burned down the temple of Dagon, with all the fugitives who had crowded into it. The enemy losses, counting those who fell by the sword and those burnt to death, totaled about 8,000 men. This act of destruction, accompanied by the considerable loss of life, reaffirms the historical awareness of the significant Phoenician religious centers during the Hellenistic era. Furthermore, the mention of Greeks referring to foxes as lamporus, due to their distinctive bushy red tails, hints at a familiarity with colloquial Greek and the cultural landscape of the Phoenician coast during the Hellenistic period. It is important to note that these observations collectively highlight a contextual framework that aligns more cohesively with the Hellenistic era, as opposed to an earlier Bronze Age setting, as the appropriate backdrop for interpreting biblical narratives. Consequently, the late interest in Phoenician Dagon temples and the mythological figure of Hercules within this era may also suggest a direct connection with the Greek language and culture. This convergence of historical and linguistic evidence urges scholars to reconsider the chronological context within which these biblical stories are situated. It would appear Russell Gmirkin and Philip Wajdenbaum are in the same way of thinking on these lines. One might reasonably consider the possibility of a connection between the Philistines and the Greeks. Numerous scholars have suggested this connection as a potential explanation for the Greek-like elements observed in characters like Samson and Goliath. Nevertheless, upon a more thorough analysis, it becomes apparent that these Greek parallels exist consistently throughout the text, spanning from Genesis to Kings, irrespective of the presence or absence of the Philistines in the narrative. Are scholars going to assume most of these narratives were written around the time the Philistines and Israelites were brushing shoulders, circa 1150 BCE to 1025 BCE? In Philip Wajdenbaum's book on page 229, he posits that there is compelling evidence suggesting the author of Genesis through Kings was familiar with the entire Heracles narrative. This is inferred from the apparent deconstruction of the Heracles story and its subsequent redistribution among the characters of Jacob, Moses, and Samson. In his discussion on pages 227 to 228, Dr. Wajdenbaum highlights a curious detail. Many have seen the similarities between Samson's tale and those Greek stories where a sneaky nighttime haircut robs a man of his strength. However, what's often missed is the intriguing link to the tale of Camaitho and her father Teralus, which ties directly to Heracles' own story. Camaitho had a thing for Amphitryon, who was married to Heracles' mom, Alcmene. Adding to the drama, Zeus disguised himself as Amphitryon for a secret night with Alcmene, while the real Amphitryon was busy at war. It seems the Samson story borrowed this haircut while sleeping idea from this tangled Greek tale. While some spotted the Camaitho-Teralus connection, they overlooked its place in the Heracles saga. Quite the oversight, wouldn't you say? Another fun fact in the Greek stories, there's a character of Echitos' daughter who was blinded and made to grind bronze. It's a bit like how Samson was blinded and had to grind mill. Check it out on page 228 of the book. Also, did you know about Virgil's story of Aristeus, the original bee guy? Turns out he messed up and caused the death of Eurydice, Orpheus's better half. To make amends, he sacrificed some cows. When he later checked on them, bees had made themselves at home, giving him back his honey source. It's a bit like Samson's story, but swap out the lion for cows. Dr. Wajdenbaum talks about it on page 225. Looking for more fun of an ancient read? Pop over to this site and check out Apollodorus' library. It's a bit after the Hebrew Bible times, but trust me, it's a classic. You'll find the tale of Teralus in section 247, and it's got connections to the famous Heracles. And if you're into dramatic family stories, don't miss the part about twins wrestling before they were even born. Kind of like the Jacob story. Happy reading. Dr. Wajdenbaum suggests that hypothesizing that the biblical Judges story was somehow written around the time of the Judges, as we said before, 1150 to 1025 BCE, is just an outdated model, which needs to be re-examined. He suggests the greater evidence leans toward a much later Greek influence, preferably when Greeks would have had major influence on these authors. The myths that are comparable to the Bible are well-developed models of the Greek counterparts and show signs of deep rationalizing, deep mythologizing of the mythical antecedents. This exercise developed later on, after the 400s BCE.
Yes, it's a myth.
What I find ironic about the scholars as I've continued to research for mythical antecedents on Samson is how often they will posit that the biblical rendition is far less fantastic, which helps them think the Samson story may have been the older one from which the Greeks borrowed from or found inspiration. Of course, compared to Heracles, Samson is far less fantastic. But the story is still mythology from start to finish, even if it's more down to earth. Isn't this just euhemerizing a mythical figure at this point? We see Gilgamesh, who was most likely deified post-death with extremely mythical narratives told of him. The same extremely mythical or fantastic element is found in Heracles, but gets significantly reduced in the Samson myth. Why doesn't this give scholars reason to pause? Why doesn't this help them see this as a rationalized account of the famous strongman myth? Samson wielding something like this. There's a hint of another guy who did something similar to Samson in the book of Judges, Shamgar son of Anath, who slew 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too was a champion of Israel. Judges 3:31. The names Shamgar and Samson even sound similar. To make a simple parallel chart for everyone, here are some jaw-dropping similarities between these two legends. Look at the chart. You'll notice Samson and Heracles have their own vertical boxes representing their sections, feature and deed. And I'm just going to list them off and understand that both have it. Source of strength, divine gift, divine heritage. Killed a lion, yes, with bare hands, yes, Nemean lion, and of course Heracles did it with bare hands. First wife's death in a fire, Samson, yes, Heracles, yes. Single-handedly defeated armies, Samson, yes, Heracles, yes. Enemies with giants, yes, with Samson, and yes, Heracles with the Cyclops. Signature weapon, jawbone of a donkey, also used as a club, and then a Heracles club. Association with two-headed canines. In Samson's case, it's actually the fox. So you have a dog-type canine creature, tied jackals in pairs, and then of course defeated Orthus in Heracles. Drank water from rock. Both Samson and Heracles did this. Tore down city gates. Samson, yes, Gaza. Heracles, yes, Troy's walls in some versions. Weakness for women. Samson, yes. Heracles, yes. Sentenced to slavery. Yes, by the Philistines at the instigation of Delilah. Yes, for the killing of his wife, Megara, in some versions. Betrayed by a man-destroyer, Delilah. And then in Heracles' cases, as some scholars might say, Deneira. It's mind-blowing how similar their stories just really are. Just a coincidence? Or is there more to it? You decide. I hope you enjoyed our little blast to the past to hear scholarship from 1907 and how scholars still double down on this being mythology. I mean, how many hero figures with divine births who wrestle lions and kill them without a weapon, have a wandering eye for the beauties, and share as many clear concepts as you have seen Samson and Heracles? I'm fully convinced that these two myths are talking to each other, or the Bible authors borrowed from the Greeks. I tend to lean on the growing trend of dating these biblical stories in the late Persian, early Hellenistic period. So much of this tale seems to rationalize a mythical figure. Heracles obviously does extremely fantastical feats. It makes sense that you would find inspiration from this story and euhemerize it in your story. I tend to think the more mythical story like Heracles is older and the Bibles may be late on the scene. Whether or not this is the case, it does nothing to discredit the fact that these stories fit into the same genre of mythology. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Samson. I hope you will like this video, comment what blew your mind, share this out to educate the world, and join MythVision's Patreon to keep this thing going. You can also join our YouTube membership program, and never forget, we are MythVision.